Genesis chapter 30, 31-ish. Here's a question I don't think you were expecting. If there was no God, how would you spend your Sunday mornings? Pardon? We certainly wouldn't be here. We certainly wouldn't be here. Actually, if you believe there is a God and there was no God, we certainly wouldn't be here. But yes, absolutely. But we certainly wouldn't be in this building. So if for some reason I managed to absolutely convince you that the whole thing was fabricated, and you were convinced by that, what would you do? If you missed the singing, if you missed the music, would you think, well, I missed this part of my life. Will I go and join a music group somewhere, or a singing group, a choir, or go and jam somewhere? If you missed the friendship, would you periodically find friends to meet with at Trentham Gardens? If you missed the teaching, would you think, well, actually, I quite like teaching. Would I join a lecture course at the local college? Or would Sunday just become another day to work and play and do the ironing? And here's another question. If there was no God to provide for you, to protect you, who would provide for you? Who would protect you? I think there are limited answers to that question. Either you would have to rely solely on yourself, or you would have to find other people you could in some measure rely on. But it would be down to you, wouldn't it, if there was no God, either to provide for yourself or to keep yourself in some other people's good books so that they helped you when they needed it. It would be down to you. And periodically, I imagine, you would think, well, what's the point anyway? Because if there's no God, when I die, I rot. And within 100 years, no one's even going to remember that I existed. So what actually is the point? If there was no God who promised his people a future beyond the grave, promised to provide for them, promised to protect them, promised to love them, it would change everything, wouldn't it? It wouldn't just change our Sunday mornings, it would change everything. Jacob, we've been looking at Jacob. I need a not so quick recap because I'm feeling slightly out of touch with Jacob, not having looked at him, shared his life for a couple of weeks now. Jacob, you remember, lived around 4,000 years ago. He lived in around about 2000 BC. We've been looking at his life over the last couple of months or so. His granddad was Abraham. Abraham was an elderly man with a wife unable to have children. God broke into Abraham's life and convinced Abraham he really did exist. And promised Abraham the unbelievable: I will make childless you, married to someone who can't have children, I will make you into a great nation. I will give you many descendants. I will give you a whole country. And we later realise that the promise is even bigger than that. And all of you will be an extraordinary blessing to the world. Abraham had Isaac, who had two sons, Esau and Jacob, both very unpromising men. Esau was a brute of a man. I do like to picture him with his camouflage gear on. The Bible describes him as godless. Jacob was a manipulative weasel. I can say this, the worst sort of accountant. He effectively stole his brother's inheritance and position as head of the family. He lied to his dad. He deceived his dad. What sort of family then ensues? Well, Esau determines to murder his brother. So Jacob literally flees for his life. He flees out of the country that God promised for him up into sort of southern Turkey up the top there. But then unexpectedly, undeservedly, Genesis chapter 28, God breaks into his life. God reveals himself in a dream. God repeats to Jacob the promises that he's made to his granddad Abraham. I am with you. I will watch over you. I will provide for you. I will return you safely back to the promised land. Jacob finds an outwardly very pretty girl called Rachel. He works 7 years in order to be married to her, but on the day of the wedding, her dad switches daughters at the front of church, and so he ends up with the less outwardly attractive girl, Leah. Nightmare. Jacob wakes up the day after his wedding, and he's discovered he's married the wrong girl. A week later, he marries the girl he wanted to marry, and then he also manages to sleep with these 2 women's maidservants. And it's just carnage, isn't it? So we've got Jacob in one household with 4 effective wives. Over 7 years, there are 12 children in this atmosphere of hostility and competition and family rows and envy, and it's just horrendous. And yet, through all of this, we, the reader, think, hey, even through all this carnage, actually, God is at work. God is majorly at work because God is keeping his promise. A big family, a huge family, is starting to take shape. So now we're into Genesis chapter 30, Genesis chapter 31, and my 3 headings, they are very simple headings, so you know exactly what I'm going to say probably. Will God provide? Will God protect? I will be with you. Will God provide? Verse 25 of chapter 30. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, that's father-in-law, send me on my way so that I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I've served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you. But Laban said to him, if I've found favour in your eyes, please stay. I've learnt by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. He added, name your wages and I'll pay them. Jacob said to him, you know how I've worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I've been. But now, when may I do something for my own household? Jacob now has a large household. 4 wives sounds pricey to me. But he's got no money because he's been working for no wages. So he says to father-in-law Laban, no, look, this is not my homeland. I need now to go home, but we've got nothing. And Laban concedes, excuse me, that he has got very rich over the previous years because of Jacob's work. So Jacob comes up with this plan. So he says to Laban, tell you what, I'll carry on working for you for a few more years, but how about if I'm paid with some of the livestock that are born from now on? That seems fair, doesn't it? And so that we know, so that we're straight with each other, ho-ho, so that we know which is which, the sheep I look after, any speckled livestock that are now born will be mine, and any single-coloured white livestock will be yours. Done, says Laban. Done being the operative word. Because Laban, the one who switched his daughters at the last moment, now rounds up all the speckled livestock and takes them away from Jacob, leaving him just the white ones, and gives the speckled livestock to his other sons, who are 3 days' walk down the road in Rugeley. This man's despicable, isn't he? Yep, your wages will now be the spotted sheep that are born. Oh gosh, look at your flock. What a shame. They're all white. This isn't looking good, really, is it? Jacob is trapped. How is he supposed to survive? How is he expected to provide for his family? We feel that sometimes, don't we? How am I supposed to provide for? I feel trapped. Well, in the remainder of chapter 30, we're told what happens next. And then chapter 31, we're told why what happened in 30 happens. Hope that makes sense. Let's go to the why first. So Jacob is talking to his wives. We are verse 10 of chapter 31. So verse 10 of chapter 31, Jacob talking to his wives, he says to them, "In the breeding season I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, spotted. The angel of the God said to me in the dream, 'Jacob.' I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, spotted. For I've seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land.'" Jacob has a dream involving speckled animals mating. I don't know what you dream of. I can honestly, hand on heart, say I have never dreamt of animals mating. But Jacob dreamt of God showing him speckled animals mating. And in other words, God is saying to him, "Look, I'm going to provide for you just as I said I would." Humanly speaking, this cannot happen because you've just got white animals in your flock. Speckled animals, you're never going to have speckled animals, never alone speckled animals mating. You're never going to build a flock because Laban's taken all the speckled animals away. You've just got white animals at the moment. This can't happen. But the point of the dream is God saying to Jacob, "But I'm going to make this happen." Genesis 31, Jacob told his wives, this is what God promised, and he told his wives that in order to explain what happened at the end of chapter 30. You can read the end of chapter 30 later, but essentially, end of chapter 30, Jacob's flock just increased exponentially. Will God provide? And we do ask ourselves that periodically. Will God provide? Well, here, yes, God did provide, just as he promised. After another 6 years, Jacob does leave, having accumulated what he needs to sustain his family. But he says to Laban then, verse 38, "I've been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flock. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself. And you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime, the cold at night. Sheep fled from my eyes." And again, I know this is a different context, but this is how we feel. I was like this for 20 years. 20 years is a long time. It was like this for 20 years. I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. Will God provide? Yeah, God will provide, just as he promised. But secondly, will God protect? All of a sudden, some characters are introduced into the story that we haven't seen before. They come at the very beginning of chapter 31. They are Rachel and Leah's brothers. We haven't come across them before. Verse 1, Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Well, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban, that's dad's father-in-law, Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude towards him was not what it had been. And again, we can get a feel of what's going on here. Jacob is suddenly doing very well, and the brothers don't like it. They're well miffed. And Laban's attitude towards Jacob is changing. So Jacob has a family crisis meeting with his wives. Please notice this is a changing Jacob. This is a changing family. Up until now, it really has looked like the Jeremy Kyle studio, but now they're having a serious family conference. Jacob's manning up. Jacob is actually godly manning up, if that's an expression. He's leading his family. He's behaving like a husband. He's talking about God. He's recalling God's promises. He says to his wives, now is the time to leave, and your dad and your brothers, they're not going to take this well. And so they fled. Now, what's going on here? I'm hoping this next illustration works. It's very time sensitive. It shows my generation entirely, so I hope this works for you. What's going on here? Well, if we have in mind Marlon Brando and Al Pacino, The Godfather, that is what is going on here. Laban, the Don Corleone of the ancient Middle East, the mafia godfather ruling his family, deciding who marries who in what order, keeping them under his thumb, cheating and deceiving and manipulating. And nephew Jacob, who he has kindly agreed can marry his daughters, who has produced his grandchildren, Jacob now thinks he's going to do a runner. Will God protect Jacob? Because Jacob needs protecting from Don Corleone. Verse 22, on the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. Make no mistake, this is a family posse. This is a hit squad going on here. You know, machine guns in violin cases. That's what's going on here. Verse 24, Then God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him, and Laban and his relatives camped there too. Then Laban said to Jacob, What have you done? You've deceived me. You've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so that I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of tambourines and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You've done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you. But last night the God of your father said to me, Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Laban is intent on getting back his daughters, getting back his grandchildren, because he's the godfather. And yes, there's this very touching speech in the middle, but it's all baloney. Why did you do this? You should have told me. I'd have had a party for you. But then he gives away the game completely by saying, verse 29, I have the power to harm you. I don't think that's what you say to your daughter's husband, is it? I have the power to harm you. You might conceivably say it to the boyfriend of your 14-year-old daughter doing drugs, but you don't say it very often otherwise, do you? I have the power to harm you. I have the power to harm you, and the only reason you're not waking up with a dead horse in your bed is that your God appeared to me in the dream and told me to call it. That is what's going on here. But our questions are now answered, aren't they? Our questions are now answered in a very real and powerful and vivid way. When the chips are down, will God provide? Yes, he will. When the chips are down, will God protect? Yes, he will. And indeed, later in the chapter, Laban caves in completely and allows Jacob to go on his way. Just on the pew sheet, I've listed some verses. I would love it if you had a moment to look them up later today. In every single one of them, you will see almost exactly the same words. You will see God making a promise to Abraham and his descendants. And the promise is repeated over and over and over again by the God of the Bible, the God who made the universe, saying to his promised people, he says, I will be with you. I will lead you to the promised land, and I will be with you. And so my third heading, unsurprisingly, is I will be with you. People say that sometimes, don't they? They say, well, I was just aware that God was with me. But what does that mean? If someone's going through some hard times and we say to them, well, God will be with you. What does that mean? What does that look like? What's the cash value of that? Well, it can mean lots of things. Of course it can mean lots of things. But we have just seen that at the very least it means that God promises to provide for us until we get to the promised land. And that God promises to protect us until we get to the promised land. And as we've seen over the last couple of months, as we've been looking in Genesis, the promised land of Israel in the Bible is a film trailer. It's a peek in advance. It's a preview of the promised land, which is the new heaven and the new earth, where you will live and work with the eternal God and his people for eternity, and everything finally will be as perfect as Eden once was. And the promise is that in the meantime, he will be with you. And what does that mean? It means he guarantees to provide for you no matter what. He guarantees to protect you no matter what. If there was no God, how Jacob spent his Sundays would have been the least of his worries. If there was no God, Jacob would have been completely on his own. He would have been destitute. He would have been defenseless. And get this, his life would have had no purpose other than to dance to the tune of those around him. But the God who made him, the God who made even his enemies, revealed himself to Jacob and said, I will be with you, I will provide you, I will protect you, and one day you will be in the promised land. That was 4,000 years ago. But of course, 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years after this event, God revealed himself not to one person, but to many people. He revealed himself not in a dream, but in the flesh. He revealed himself in the person of Jesus. Now, we know lots about Jesus, but let me remind you of his parting words to his disciples, because they might just strike a chord. End of Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 28. I'll read you a couple of sentences beforehand, but it's the last sentence that will make your ears prick up. So Jesus speaking to his disciples, saying, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely, what are the words that come next? And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age. Just in case you were worried, you don't need to go and find something else to do on a Sunday morning. Actually, I say that with a smile on my face. please don't find anything better to do on a Sunday. Please will you protect our children from being conned into believing that there are better things to do on a Sunday. There is nothing better than being with God's people on a Sunday, because together we learn, together we relearn that there is a God who is present with his people. He will lead you to the promised land. And even in the Jacob-like chaos of our sometimes very tricky lives, and I have an inkling what's going on in some of your lives, and they are extraordinarily difficult. Will God protect you? Will God provide for you? Oh yes. He is the one who has all authority, and he's promised, I am with you always, to the very end of the age, to the day I see you in the promised land. Amen.